In 1995, the small town of Willow Creek looked like the kind of place where nothing truly sinister could happen. Families left their doors unlocked, neighbors knew each other by name, and gossip revolved more around church bake sales than anything dark. But what no one knew, not then, not for many years, was that within one tidy brick house on the edge of town lived a man who would murder not once, but twice, and almost slip away without consequence. His name was Richard Hale. To his neighbors, he was a dependable husband, the quiet provider. But beneath that calm surface was a darkness that even those closest to him couldn't see, until it was too late. If you enjoy stories of deception, secrets, and chilling betrayals, you'll want to stay with this one until the very end. Because Richard's crimes weren't just about murder. They were about control, manipulation, and the terrifying ease with which evil can hide in plain sight. Before we dive into the full part of the story, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and also follow for more interesting stories to come. Richard was 34 when it happened the first time. His wife, Margaret, was 10 years younger, bright-eyed and cheerful, the kind of woman who could light up a room with a laugh. They'd been married for 5 years, and to most people, they seemed happy. Margaret spoke about wanting children soon, talk of repainting the spare room, and planned weekend trips that Richard always seemed too tired to take. But beneath the surface, the marriage was strained. Richard was not the man Margaret thought she had married. He was controlling in subtle, insidious ways, picking at her choices, criticizing her tone, deciding who she should or shouldn't spend time with. He was careful never to explode in public, but behind closed doors his temper was a force Margaret had come to fear. On the night of October 14th, 1995, Margaret didn't show up at her friend Claire's house as she promised. Claire tried calling several times, but the phone went unanswered. The next morning, Richard appeared at the police station, his eyes red, his voice trembling as he reported that Margaret hadn't come home. He suggested maybe she'd gone for a walk, maybe she'd met someone else. He painted himself as a worried husband blindsided by his wife's disappearance. A search began. Flyers were printed. For weeks, Willow Creek buzzed with speculation. Had Margaret run away? Had something terrible happened? Richard gave interviews on the local news, pleading for his wife to come home, his voice breaking at just the right moments. People pitied him. The man who had lost his wife, left behind, confused, heartbroken. But behind the facade, Richard already knew the truth. Margaret wasn't missing. She was buried deep in the woods, a shallow grave covered in leaves and date. No one knew that during a heated argument in their home, Richard had snapped. Margaret had threatened to leave him, to take what little money they had and never look back. And Richard couldn't stand the idea of losing control. He struck her once hard enough to make her fall. When she tried to get up, he wrapped his hands around her throat and didn't let go until she stopped moving. For months, the case remained unsolved. People whispered, but without evidence, the police could do nothing. Eventually, the search quieted down. Life went on. Richard sold the house they had shared, moved 2 towns over, and began again. By 1997, Richard had remarried. His second wife, Laura, was a school teacher. She was gentle, trusting, and eager to build a family. To her, Richard seemed like the kind of man who wanted stability, who valued loyalty. She didn't know that Margaret's ghost lingered in the shadows of their home. For a while, Richard played the role well. He bought Laura flowers, helped fix things around the house, and smiled in photographs. But the mask slipped slowly, just as it had before. He became possessive, irritated when Laura stayed late at work, questioning her whenever she met friends without him. Laura chalked it up to stress. She told herself he loved her too much, that it was just his way of showing he cared. By 1999, Laura had begun to notice more frightening patterns. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night to find Richard staring at her, silent, unblinking. He seemed to know where she had been even when she hadn't told him. and his temper, though still controlled in public, was beginning to surface in ways she could no longer ignore. On June 2nd of that year, Laura's sister received a call. Richard's voice was panicked, urgent. He said Laura had fallen down the stairs. He said it was an accident, that she had slipped while carrying laundry. By the time the paramedics arrived, Laura was dead. Her body lay twisted at the bottom of the staircase, her neck broken. The tragedy shocked everyone who knew her. The funeral was filled with colleagues, students, and grieving family members. Richard stood at the front, tears streaming down his face, thanking people for their condolences. To most, he was a picture of a man devastated by loss, for the second time in just a few years. But Laura's sister, Diane, felt something wasn't right. She couldn't shake the unease in her gut. Laura had been healthy, careful, steady on her feet, and there had been phone calls, late-night confessions, half-whispered doubts Laura had shared with her. Diane remembered her sister saying once, "Sometimes I'm scared of him, but I don't know why." Diane went to the police. She begged them to look deeper, to not accept the story of an accident so easily. At first, they brushed her off. There was no evidence of foul play. The scene looked consistent with the fall. Richard had an alibi of being at home when it happened, which, of course, he was. But Diane refused to give up. She pushed for an autopsy, and when it came back, there were details that didn't fit. The bruises on Laura's neck weren't consistent with fall. They were consistent with strangulation. That single detail cracked Richard's carefully built facade. Police reopened the case, and as they dug into his past, Margaret's disappearance resurfaced. Witness statements, old rumors, inconsistencies in Richard's accounts. Piece by piece, a picture began to emerge. By the time Richard was brought in for questioning, his calm demeanor was slipping. Detectives pressed him on Margaret, on Laura, on the bruises, the lies, the too perfect tears. Richard denied. But as the hours wore on, the weight of his secrets grew heavier. In the end, it wasn't a dramatic confession that gave him away. It was arrogance. He thought he had covered his tracks so well. But killers who get away once often believe they can get away forever. Richard wasn't careful enough. His past came back to haunt him, and the truth was closing in. Detectives didn't let Richard go home after that first round of questioning. They had no formal charge yet, but they had suspicions too heavy to ignore. Instead, they kept digging, retracing every step of both women's lives, looking for threads that might unravel the careful web Richard had spun. Margaret's case file, long buried under dust in the archives, was pulled out again. The notes from 1995 painted a vague picture of a woman who had supposedly vanished. At the time, Richard's grief had been convincing enough that police didn't push him. But now, with Laura's autopsy showing signs of strangulation, the parallels were chilling. 2 wives, 2 sudden deaths. One man standing at the center of both tragedies. The investigators started small. They interviewed Margaret's old friends, who spoke of a growing unhappiness, a whispered phase. Claire, the woman who had expected Margaret that night in 1995, recalled her last conversation. She told me she couldn't take it anymore, that she was going to leave him. She sounded scared. That detail, the threat of leaving, was a crucial crack in Richard's story. It aligned perfectly with the autopsy report of Laura's injuries. Both women had been silenced at the moment they showed signs of independence. Detectives returned to Richard's house with a search warrant. They combed through every drawer, every closet, every trace of his carefully arranged life. In the basement, they found a box tucked behind old paint cans. Inside were photographs, letters, keepsake from both marriages. At first glance, it looked harmless, just mementos of the past. But one envelope stood out. It contained a set of Margaret's jewelry, pieces of family had assumed she took with her when she disappeared. The items were clean, carefully preserved, as though Richard had wanted to keep a piece of her forever. The discovery strengthened the suspicion, but it wasn't enough for conviction. They needed a body. They needed something physical to tie Richard to the crimes. Weeks passed, and then a break came. A hiker reported finding bones deep in the Willow Creek woods, half buried under years of soil and leaves. Forensics confirmed what Diane had feared all along. It was Margaret. The evidence mounted quickly after that. The bruises on Margaret's remains echoed the same marks found on Laura. The patterns of violence were identical. 2 women, 2 lives cut short, 2 bodies telling the same story of hands tightening around their throats. Richard was arrested in November 1999. The news hit Willow Creek like a thunderclap. Neighbors who once pitied him now stared at the television in shock. The man who had cried on camera, begging for help to find his wife, was now accused of murdering not just 1, but 2 women who had trusted him. In jail, Richard remained calm. He insisted on his innocence, painting himself again as a victim of misunderstanding, a man haunted by bad luck and false assumptions. He hired an expensive lawyer, confident that the lack of direct witnesses would work in his favor. He almost believed his own lies. The trial began in early 2001, and from the start, it captivated the public. Courtrooms filled with reporters, locals, and curious onlookers who wanted to see the man behind the mask. Richard walked in wearing a suit, his hair neatly combed, his face set in the same mournful expression he had perfected years before. He was ready to play the role of the grieving husband one more time. The prosecution, however, was relentless. They laid out the timeline of both marriages, the controlling behavior, the arguments, the fear each woman expressed before her death. They showed the autopsy photographs, the bruises, the broken bones. They presented Margaret's jewelry found in his basement, proof he had lied when he claimed she had run away. But Richard's defense was sharp. His lawyer argued that Margaret could have died by other means, that the body had been too decomposed to give a definitive cause of death. As for Laura, the defense claimed the bruises could have been from a fall, that the autopsy was being interpreted in the worst possible light. They reminded the jury that Richard had never been seen harming either woman. Circumstantial evidence, they called it. Nothing more. For weeks, the courtroom was a battlefield. The jury listened, torn between 2 narratives: the image of a grieving husband cruelly accused, and the chilling possibility of a man who had killed twice without remorse. Then Diane took the stand. Laura's sister spoke with a steady voice, though her hands trembled. She recounted Laura's fears, the phone calls late at night, the unease that had grown heavy in her sister's marriage. She told me she didn't feel safe. Diane said, her eyes fixed on Richard. She told me she thought he would never let her leave. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument the lawyers could make. For the first time, Richard's mask cracked. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, and for a brief second, the charm slipped away to reveal the cold fury underneath. The jury saw it. Everyone saw it. When it came time for closing arguments, the prosecution delivered one final blow. This is not a case of coincidence. This is not bad luck. This is a man who murdered 2 women, women who trusted him, women who tried to leave him. He silenced them both in the same way, and he thought he could get away with it forever. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was read. Guilty on both counts of murder. Richard's face barely moved. He sat stiff, lips pressed in a thin line, as though the words meant nothing. Only when the sentence was given, life without parole, did his composure falter. For the first time in years, his control slipped completely. He shouted, called it unfair, claimed he was being framed. But the jury, the families, the world watching had already seen the truth. Richard Hale was led away in handcuffs, no longer the grieving husband, no longer the man who could manipulate pity into protection. He was exposed, stripped of his mask, and condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Even so, People whispered that if it hadn't been for Diane's persistence, for a refusal to accept the easy story of an accident, Richard might have gotten away with it. Twice. Some wondered if there were more women, more secrets buried in the shadows of his past. The thought lingered long after the trial ended, that evil could sit at your dinner table, mow the lawn next door, smile politely in the grocery store, and you would never know until it was too late. In the quiet town of Willow Creek, doors began to lock at night. Neighbors looked at one another a little differently, and the name Richard Hale became a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who wear the mask of love. Prison did not change Richard Hale. If anything, it revealed him more plainly than life outside ever could. Behind the gray walls and barbed wire, he no longer had to play the role of the grieving husband or the respectable neighbor. There were no cameras, no juries, no neighbors to charm. What remained was a cold, calculating man beneath the mask. At first, the other inmates regarded him with curiosity. Some had seen the trial on television, others had only heard whispers. A man who killed 2 wives and pretended to be a victim. That kind of story spreads quickly in prison yards. Richard didn't flinch under the stays. He carried himself with the same quiet confidence he'd always had, as though he was still in control. He wrote letters, long, rambling accounts of how he had been wronged by the system, how the jury had been biased, how his wife had misunderstood him. In these letters, he painted himself as a victim again, spinning his narrative for anyone who would listen. A few people on the outside believed him at first, sympathizers who thought the justice system had gone too far. But eventually, the weight of the evidence drowned out his words. His letters stopped mattering. Inside, Richard quickly learned that his charm had limits. Manipulating hardened men who had seen every kind of deception wasn't easy. Some mocked him, others avoided him, and a few, especially those who had daughters, sisters, wives, looked at him with a quiet hatred. He wasn't respected in prison the way some killers are. He was despised, even among criminals, for preying on women who had trusted him. Yet Richard adapted. He had always been patient, always calculating. He kept to himself, avoided fights, and built small alliances when necessary. He learned the routines, the guard schedules, the weaknesses in the system. It wasn't that he planned to escape. He knew that was impossible. But he never let go of the habit of control, of watching, of calculating. Outside the prison walls, life slowly moved on. Diane, Laura's sister, became a quiet advocate for domestic abuse survivors. She told her sister's story at community centers, warning others about the signs she had missed, the doubt she had silenced. She lived with the grief of knowing she couldn't save Laura, but also with the strength of knowing she had stopped Richard from hurting anyone else. Her persistence had been the difference between justice and another unsolved mystery. Margaret's family, after years of uncertainty, finally had answers. Her body was laid to rest properly, her name carved into a stone that marked the end of a life cut short. For them, the pain never fully healed. But the truth, though brutal, gave them a kind of closure that had been denied for nearly 5 years. Richard remained in prison for the rest of his days. Over the years, he aged, his once dark hair turning gray, his confident posture slumping under the weight of time. But he never admitted guilt. Even as parole hearings came and went, hearings he was denied every time, he repeated the same lies. I didn't do it. They wanted to believe the worst about me. I love my wives. His words never changed, as though rehearsed 1,000 times in the mirror of his mind. But the truth was carved into every bruise, every bone, every whispered warning Margaret and Laura had tried to share. The truth had been written in the fear they carried, in the courage Diane found, in the evidence buried in the woods. And yet, to the end, Richard believed he had almost beaten the system. He told fellow inmates that if Laura's sister hadn't pushed so hard, if the autopsy had been less precise, if Margaret's remains had never been found, he would have been free. He would have started again, maybe even married a third time. That thought chilled anyone who heard it, that there could have been more victims, more lives stolen, more families shattered. When Richard finally died in 2017, alone in his prison cell, the news barely made a ripple outside the walls of the facility. A few newspapers printed small obituaries, noting his conviction and his crimes. To most, he was already forgotten, his name a footnote in the long list of men who had hidden their darkness behind masks of normalcy. But for those who remembered, Margaret's family, Laura's sister, the investigators who had worked the case, his death was more than an ending. It was a reminder of the thin line between the ordinary and the monstrous. Richard had lived for years as a husband, a neighbor, a man who mowed his lawn and smiled at strangers. And yet, behind closed doors, he had been capable of unimaginable cruelty. The story of Richard Hale lingered in Willow Creek long after. Parents told their daughters to trust their instincts, to never ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. Neighbors remembered how easily they had been fooled, how they had pitied him, defended him, even prayed for him. And they whispered about the narrowness of his downfall, how close he had come to escaping justice. Twice. What haunted them most wasn't just what Richard had done, but how ordinary he had seemed. Evil hadn't looked like a monster in their town. It had looked like a husband, a man who waved hello from across the street, who carried groceries, who shed crocodile tears on television. In the end, Richard Hale's story was not just about murder. It was about deception, about how far someone could go to protect their image, about how easily entire communities could be blinded by performance. It was about the strength of one woman, Diane, who refused to let her sister's death be dismissed as an accident. It was about the danger of silence, the cost of ignoring warning signs, the price of believing appearances. Richard thought he could bury the truth forever. He thought control would always be his. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's hidden. Margaret's grave proved it. Laura's bruises proved it. And in the end, so did his own downfall. He almost got away with it. Almost.